December 31st, 1990. Midnight approaches. The Soviet Union still stands on the map as a single superpower. 15 republics. One red flag over the Kremlin. One central government in Moscow. One political system that claims it can outlast the century. 1 year later, on December 26th, 1991, the Soviet Union will be gone. Not defeated by a foreign army. Not conquered by invasion. It will collapse from the inside in public view, month by month, as if the country itself is unfastening its own bolts. This is not a story about a single decision or a single villain. It is a story about a chain reaction. Every event pulls the next. Every attempt to save the system makes the system weaker. Every compromise arrives too late. Every display of force creates more resistance. And in the end, the state becomes a shell. Still labeled, still stamped, still speaking, but no longer obeyed. In 1991, people across the Soviet Union will watch the same signs appear everywhere. Empty shelves, long lines, collapsing supply chains, and the growing sense that Moscow's orders no longer matter. At the same time, leaders in the republics will discover something even more dangerous than anger. Momentum. Momentum is what destroys empires. Because once the first pieces break away and survive, the rest stop fearing the center. They stop waiting for permission. They begin to treat the Union not as a homeland, but as an obstacle. In January, the cracks will bleed. In spring, the economy will weaken further. In June, Russia will elect a rival leader with a popular mandate. In August, the old guard will try to reverse time by force. They will fail, and their failure will accelerate everything they wanted to stop. In December, the Soviet Union will be dissolved by the leaders of 3 republics, without the Soviet president even in the room. This is 1991, the final year, the year the Soviet Union dies. January 1991 begins with the Soviet Union still intact in law, but already fractured in reality. The Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, have already declared independence in 1990. Moscow refuses to recognize those declarations. The Kremlin insists the Baltics remain part of the Soviet Union. The Baltics insist Moscow no longer has authority there. The disagreement is not theoretical. It is physical. It is about who controls the streets, the television towers, and the ability to broadcast the future. On January 13th, 1991, in Vilnius, Lithuania, Soviet forces move to seize the television tower. Tanks roll into the city. Soldiers push toward crowds of civilians who have gathered to defend the station. People stand unarmed in front of armored vehicles. They sing. They link arms. They try to stop history with their bodies. It does not work. The assault becomes deadly. 14 civilians are killed and hundreds are injured. Images and reports spread quickly. The violence is seen not as a return to order, but as proof that Moscow, when threatened, still reaches for force. The result is the opposite of what the hardliners want. Lithuania does not surrender. The Baltic movements do not collapse. Instead, the assault hardens them. It convinces more people that there is no compromise that guarantees safety under the Soviet center. If Moscow can send tanks for a television tower, what else will it do when independence is declared? For Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet president, the damage is severe. He denies ordering the attack. But the Soviet system still belongs to him in the eyes of the world. Denial does not restore credibility. It creates suspicion. The Soviet president appears either ruthless or powerless. Both images are fatal for a leader trying to hold an empire together through reform. At the same time, Boris Yeltsin, the rising leader of Russia within the Soviet Union, begins to move more openly against the Soviet center. The more Moscow looks like force and confusion, the more Yeltsin can position himself as the alternative. Not an enemy of the people, but an enemy of the collapsing structure that keeps the people poor and silent. By the end of January, the Soviet Union is still alive. But the most dangerous lesson of the year has already been taught. The center can bleed. And when the center bleeds, the periphery stops being afraid. February does not bring stability. It brings a desperate attempt to manufacture it. Gorbachev wants proof to himself, proof to the Soviet public, proof to the world, that the Union still has a mandate to exist. So the Kremlin prepares a referendum. The concept is simple. Ask the citizens whether they want the Soviet Union preserved as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics. The referendum takes place on March 17, 1991, but its shadow hangs over February like a clock. Gorbachev believes the vote will strengthen him. He believes a clear yes will stop the republics from running. He believes it will slow history down. Yet even before the ballots are counted, the referendum reveals the truth. Parts of the Soviet Union no longer accept Moscow's right to ask the question. Several republics refuse to participate. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia boycott. Georgia boycotts. Armenia boycotts. Moldova boycotts. They treat the Soviet referendum as foreign political theater, not as their own civic decision. Even in republics that do participate, the meaning of the vote fractures. The people may fear collapse. They may hope for reform. They may vote yes because they are afraid of chaos. But a yes in 1991 does not mean loyalty to a Soviet center. It means the population is exhausted and wants stability, not ideology. Meanwhile, the economy worsens. The Soviet state has money on paper, but fewer and fewer goods in reality. Rationing spreads. Lines become daily life. The country begins to operate on rumor. Someone heard meat arrived at a store. Someone heard sugar is being sold. Someone heard soap is available. People run, because if you do not run, you get nothing. In such conditions, the Soviet myth of planned abundance becomes a joke everyone tells quietly, and no one believes publicly. The system that claimed to provide security now cannot provide bread. And when a state cannot provide basics, its moral authority collapses faster than its institutions. February ends with two competing realities: a Soviet president trying to prove legitimacy through a vote, and a Soviet population watching legitimacy dissolve in grocery lines. The referendum may produce numbers, but numbers do not fill shelves. Numbers do not repair trust. Numbers do not stop republics that no longer recognize the center. March arrives with a country in motion and a government attempting to pretend it is still in control. On March 17th, the referendum is held. Millions vote. The official result is a strong yes in favor of preserving the Union. On paper, Gorbachev has his mandate. But the boycott matters. The absence matters. The republics that refuse to participate are not minor pieces. Their refusal signals a new principle. Sovereignty is not a request. It is an announcement. Even where yes wins, the interpretation splits. Many citizens vote yes because they fear instability. They fear empty shelves will become hunger. They fear that reforms will become lawlessness. They do not vote to preserve Soviet ideology. They vote to preserve their own daily survival. And while the Kremlin celebrates percentages, the deeper forces of collapse continue to work. Strikes erupt and spread, especially among miners and industrial workers. Groups that are supposed to be the foundation of Soviet power. When miners stop working, the state feels it immediately. Coal fuels industry. Coal powers cities. Coal is not just a commodity, it is the nervous system of production. The strikes are not merely about wages. They become political. Workers openly attack the Communist Party. They demand deeper change. And in many regions, they look to Yeltsin, not Gorbachev. The shift is visible. Legitimacy begins to flow away from the Soviet center and toward the Russian Republican center. This is one of the most dangerous developments of the year. The rebellion is no longer only between Moscow and the republics. It is also within the heart of the Union itself. Inside Russia, inside the factories, inside the workforce that the Soviet state claims to represent. As March ends, the Soviet Union faces three simultaneous crises. A legitimacy crisis, because the referendum does not produce obedience. An economic crisis, because rationing and shortages intensify. And a political crisis, because Russia, the core republic, is preparing to elevate Yeltsin through popular election. An empire can survive one crisis at a time. But 1991 is not one crisis. It is a pile of crises that feed each other. April begins with the first major non-Baltic break. On April 9, 1991, Georgia declares independence. This is a crucial moment. The Baltic republics can be framed by Moscow as special cases, territories annexed in 1940, nations that never fully accepted Soviet rule. Georgia is different. Georgia is a founding republic of the Soviet Union. Georgia's departure is a declaration that the Union is not just shrinking at the edges, it is cracking through the middle. The Soviet center refuses to recognize Georgian independence. In Soviet law, secession is complex and controlled. In reality, law has become weaker than momentum. Georgia's independence also signals something else. The year is no longer about negotiating autonomy. It is about exiting the system entirely. That shift in goal is everything. Once republics aim for exit rather than reform, compromises become meaningless. The center can offer more autonomy, more rights, more promises. But the republics no longer believe promises. At the same time, Gorbachev's last great plan takes shape. The new Union Treaty. The idea is to transform the Soviet Union into a looser federation, a union of sovereign states rather than a centralized empire. Republics would gain control over resources and law enforcement. The center would retain defense and foreign policy. It is a desperate attempt to keep the structure intact by making it less Soviet. But the new Union Treaty also terrifies Soviet hardliners. To them, it is the end of the country they served. It is not reform. It is surrender. It is legal dismemberment. While the treaty is negotiated, the economy does not pause. People continue to queue. Inflation continues to rise. Supply chains continue to fail. Every day of economic chaos is political fuel for secession. By the end of April, one thing becomes clear. The Soviet Union is now losing republics, not merely controlling them with difficulty. The process is no longer hypothetical. It is real, legal, and contagious. May is the month when collapse becomes visible in daily life. Rationing spreads further. Coupons become routine. People begin to plan their days around lines. They plan not around work, not around family, but around the possibility of obtaining basics. The Soviet economy enters a strange phase where money exists, but goods do not. Factories continue to operate, but distribution fails. Goods vanish into warehouses, into corruption networks, into private trade. Official stores display empty shelves like a confession. Barter grows. Vodka becomes currency. Cigarettes become currency. A mechanic's repair becomes currency. The ruble loses not only value, but meaning. When people stop trusting money, they stop trusting the state that prints it. A Soviet citizen in May 1991 lives with constant calculation. What can be obtained? What must be saved? What can be traded? What must be hidden? Hoarding becomes rationale. Panic becomes normal. Political consequences follow. When the state cannot provide, the state cannot demand. When the system cannot feed you, why should you obey it? That question does not need to be shouted. It spreads quietly through kitchens, stairwells, and crowded buses. May ends with a society preparing for something, even if it cannot name it. People do not yet say the Soviet Union will end this year. But they feel something is breaking. They can hear it in the silence of empty stores. June is the turning point for the internal balance of power. On June 12, 1991, Russia holds a presidential election. It is a historic moment. Russia, the largest Soviet republic, elects its leader by popular vote. And Boris Yeltsin wins decisively, taking 57% in the first round. This matters more than any referendum. Yeltsin now has direct democratic legitimacy. Gorbachev does not. Gorbachev is president of the Soviet Union through Soviet political mechanisms. Yeltsin is president of Russia through a popular mandate. From this point forward, the Soviet Union is effectively governed by two competing centers: the Soviet center in the Kremlin and the Russian center in the White House of Russia. And because Russia is the core of the Union, its population, resources, industry, and military weight, this rivalry is fatal. Yeltsin's victory also sends a signal to the republics. If Russia itself is becoming sovereign, why should anyone else remain bound? If the core is redefining itself, the periphery will not stay loyal to a structure even Russia is abandoning. Gorbachev continues pushing the new Union Treaty, hoping it will preserve a reformed Union. But Yeltsin now negotiates from strength, not cooperation. He wants Russia's sovereignty recognized. He wants control over Russian resources. He wants the center weakened. For Soviet hardliners, June is alarming. They see that Gorbachev is not only losing republics, he is losing Russia. And if Russia leaves, the Soviet Union cannot exist. There is no Soviet Union without Russia. June ends with the empire in a new phase. The collapse is no longer only external pressure from republics. It is internal competition from the core. The Soviet president is still in office, but the Soviet presidency has been outclassed by a Russian presidency. July is the calm before the storm. The new Union Treaty is scheduled to be signed in August. Gorbachev believes it will save the Union. Many republic leaders treat it as a step toward full sovereignty. Yeltsin treats it as leverage to weaken the center further. Hardliners, meanwhile, treat the treaty as the moment to act. Because once the treaty is signed, the centralized Soviet state is finished by law. The army will fragment. The party will lose its remaining grip. The Soviet Union will become a loose association that may unravel quickly anyway. In July, the conspiracy crystallizes. Senior officials, within the government, within the security services, within the military, begin planning an emergency seizure of power. The goal is simple: stop the treaty, restore central authority, reverse the course of disintegration. To them, it is a rescue operation. To history, it will become the trigger that accelerates the collapse. While elites plan, ordinary citizens continue to live the economic nightmare. Shortages grow. Inflation eats savings. The gap between official reality and lived reality widens to the point of absurdity. July ends with an approaching deadline and a country balanced on a knife edge. The treaty signing is near. The hardliners are ready. The reformers are exhausted. The republics are watching. Russia is preparing to act as a sovereign state, regardless of what the Soviet center wants. The Soviet Union enters August already mortally wounded. It just does not yet know where the final blow will land. August 1991 begins with the Soviet Union already trembling. The new Union Treaty is scheduled to be signed later in the month. To reformers, it is the last chance to keep the state together by loosening it. To hardliners, it is the final surrender. And to many Republic leaders, it is simply a bridge to full independence. In the early hours of August 19, 1991, that fragile balance snaps. State television interrupts normal programming. The message is blunt. President Mikhail Gorbachev is unable to perform his duties due to health reasons. Vice President Gennady Yanayev assumes presidential powers. A new body is announced, the State Committee on the State of Emergency. On paper, it is a legal emergency. In reality, it is a coup. Tanks move into Moscow. Armored vehicles appear at key intersections. Soldiers take positions near government buildings. Orders go out restricting gatherings. Certain newspapers are suspended. The government tries to create an atmosphere of inevitability. The state is back. The line is restored. Resistance is pointless. But the most critical detail is hidden from the public. Gorbachev is not ill. He is isolated. At his dacha in Foros, Crimea, Gorbachev is cut off. Communications fail. Guards control movement. Representatives of the coup attempt to force him to sign emergency decrees. He refuses. They leave him detained, betting that without him, the country will accept a new authority. They miscalculate a second force they cannot control. Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin rushes to the Russian White House, the parliament building of the Russian Republic. Inside, his team prepares a response. Outside, citizens gather. The Soviet coup leaders have tanks. Yeltsin has something more dangerous: legitimacy. He was elected by popular vote in June. He can speak as a chosen leader. The coup leaders speak as men trying to seize history by force. Yeltsin denounces the coup as unconstitutional. He calls for resistance. He appeals to soldiers not to obey illegal orders. He urges citizens to defend democratic change. His words travel through radio signals, fax machines, phone calls, and word of mouth. And then comes the image that defines the collapse. Yeltsin climbs onto a tank outside the White House. He stands on the turret and reads his statement. Cameras record. The footage spreads. The world sees a Russian leader on a Soviet tank, defying a Soviet coup. The symbolism is impossible to miss. The empire's machinery is no longer loyal to the empire. Throughout August 19th and August 20th, the atmosphere in Moscow becomes tense and surreal. Thousands defend the White House. Barricades appear. People bring food, wood, metal, anything to block vehicles. They talk quietly, as if speaking loudly might summon violence. The coup leaders hold press conferences. Their faces look uncertain. Their hands tremble. Their words do not convince. They sound like men reading from an era that has ended. The military hesitates. Some units remain loyal to orders. Others refuse. Some commanders stall. Some soldiers sympathize with citizens. Some tanks end up defending the protesters rather than threatening them. The coup depends on obedience, and obedience is no longer guaranteed. On the night of August 20th into August 21st, the danger peaks. Armored vehicles move through Moscow. A confrontation near a tunnel ends in tragedy. 3 men are killed amid the chaos. Their deaths become the coup's final failure. Instead of terrorizing the population into submission, blood hardens resistance. By the morning of August 21st, the coup collapses. Units withdraw. Leaders flee or are arrested. The emergency committee fractures. The attempt to freeze time is over. Gorbachev returns to Moscow, but he returns to a different country. He expects to reclaim authority. He finds his authority replaced. Yeltsin is the hero of the moment. The Communist Party is discredited. The Soviet center looks helpless. The coup was meant to save the Soviet Union. In practice, it kills it. Because after August 21st, the republics stop negotiating and start leaving. Ukraine moves first, and its decision seals the fate of the entire state. On August 24th, 1991, Ukraine declares independence. This is not a peripheral loss. Ukraine is the second largest republic, a massive industrial and agricultural base, a crucial component of Soviet identity and power. Without Ukraine, the Soviet Union cannot remain a superpower. Without Ukraine, the Soviet Union is not even the same country. Belarus follows on August 25th, declaring independence. Moldova follows on August 27th. Kyrgyzstan follows on August 31st. Uzbekistan follows immediately after, marking independence at the start of September. Within days of the coup's failure, the Union loses the political illusion that it can still function as one state. The center has no coercive credibility left. It tried force, and it failed publicly. Now every republic knows the same thing. Moscow can no longer impose unity. Yeltsin accelerates the destruction of the Soviet system from inside Russia. He moves against the Communist Party's infrastructure on Russian territory. Party property is seized. Party influence is pushed out of institutions. The symbols of Soviet authority are dismantled. A statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the Soviet secret police, is removed from its position in Moscow. Crowds celebrate. It is not just a monument falling. It is the visible collapse of fear. September arrives as the month of formal departures and acknowledgements. Uzbekistan's independence is recognized at the start of the month. Tajikistan declares independence on September 9th, 1991. Armenia declares independence on September 21st, 1991. On September 6th, 1991, in one of the most symbolic acts of the year, the Soviet government recognizes the independence of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. For many months, the Baltics declared themselves independent, while Moscow insisted they were still Soviet. Now, Moscow admits the truth. The empire concedes that its border has moved. Each declaration changes the political environment. Every republic that leaves makes it easier for the next. What was once unthinkable becomes routine. The act of leaving loses its danger and becomes a standard step in state building. By late September, the Soviet Union is no longer a functioning federation. It is a title held over a fractured geography. Gorbachev still speaks as Soviet president, but republic leaders increasingly ignore him. They negotiate with each other, not with the center. They treat Moscow as an outdated administrative layer, not a capital. October brings the exit of the remaining undecided republics outside the last two. Azerbaijan declares independence on October 18, 1991. Turkmenistan declares independence on October 27, 1991. Two more republics step out of the Soviet structure. By the end of October, only Russia and Kazakhstan have not formally declared independence. But Russia is already acting as sovereign under Yeltsin. Russia controls resources. Russia assumes Soviet functions on its territory. Russia increasingly behaves as the successor state, rather than a component of a union. Kazakhstan delays not because it believes in the Soviet future, but because it wants to manage the transition. It wants stability, guarantees, and a safer landing. In a collapsing empire, timing matters. Kazakhstan waits to jump until it sees where the ground will be. Meanwhile, the economic collapse continues. Republics stop sending revenues to the Soviet budget. The center becomes financially hollow. Ministries in Moscow lose the ability to pay salaries, maintain services, or enforce decisions. Institutions remain in place like empty buildings. Doors open, lights on, but no power inside. The military becomes a separate crisis. The Soviet armed forces were designed as a single machine, but now the machine is being divided. Republics claim units stationed on their territory. Command structures blur. Loyalty becomes uncertain. And behind it all sits the most terrifying question: nuclear weapons. The Soviet nuclear arsenal exists across multiple republics, especially Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. In a stable state, nuclear command is centralized. In a collapsing state, the idea of centralized command becomes fragile. The world watches carefully. Diplomats begin making arrangements, building relationships with Republican leaders, ensuring control does not fragment into chaos. November arrives like a long, cold hallway toward the final door. Legally, the Soviet Union still exists. Practically, it does not. Negotiations continue about a new framework, a loose association, a commonwealth, a cooperative mechanism to manage the economic and security fallout. Not a Soviet Union, but a post-Soviet structure. The republics want coordination, but they do not want a center. The goal is no longer preservation. The goal is damage control. Ukraine becomes the key. Its independence declaration on August 24th is powerful, but the final seal will come through a referendum. On December 1st, 1991, Ukraine will vote. If the Ukrainian public confirms independence, no Soviet structure can claim legitimacy. A union cannot exist when one of its core republics has a democratic mandate to leave. Gorbachev knows this. He tries to keep Ukraine in some form of union. He argues for cooperation. He warns of economic collapse. He speaks of historical ties. But his words do not stop the momentum. Ukraine has already moved beyond persuasion. Russia under Yeltsin also moves beyond Gorbachev. Yeltsin builds direct relationships with other Republican leaders. He positions Russia not as a member of the Soviet Union, but as the nucleus of whatever comes after it. This is critical. The Soviet president is being replaced not only by independence movements, but by the Russian president as the new central negotiator. By the end of November, the Soviet Union is waiting for a final confirmation of death. December begins with that confirmation. On December 1st, 1991, Ukraine holds its independence referendum. Turnout is high. The result is overwhelming. More than 90% vote in favor of independence. On the same day, Ukraine elects Leonid Kravchuk as president. This changes everything instantly. An empire might survive elite declarations. It cannot survive a massive democratic mandate from one of its core nations. After December 1st, the Soviet Union is beyond saving. Not because leaders refuse to save it, but because it no longer has the legal and political foundation to exist. 7 days later, the empire is dissolved not by the Soviet center, but by Republican leaders meeting without it. On December 8, 1991, in the Belavezha Pushcha forest in Belarus, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus meet. Boris Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk, and Stanislav Shushkevich. These three republics were the founding republics of the Soviet Union in 1922. Now they decide to end it. They sign the Belavezha Accords. The language is direct. The Soviet Union no longer exists as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality. They create a new association, the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev is not invited. He is not consulted. He is informed after the fact. The Soviet president responds with anger and accusations. He calls the agreement illegal. But legality is no longer enforced by the Soviet center. The center has no coercive mechanism. It has no obedience. It has no army willing to act on its behalf. It has no funds. It has no authority. In a collapsing state, law follows power. Gorbachev has law. Yeltsin has power. In mid-December, the final formal exits occur. On December 12, 1991, Russia formalizes its move away from Soviet structures. Russia is already sovereign in practice, but now it makes the separation clear in law and institutions. Russia positions itself as the successor state, inheriting responsibilities and privileges. On December 16, 1991, Kazakhstan declares independence. Kazakhstan becomes the last Soviet republic to do so. It is a moment heavy with symbolism. In the final days, the Soviet Union becomes almost absurd. A state with one remaining republic and a president whose authority no longer extends anywhere. On December 21, 1991, leaders of 11 republics meet in Almaty and sign the Alma-Ata Protocol, formalizing the Commonwealth of Independent States and confirming the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The republics agree on principles of cooperation and transition. They confirm that the Soviet Union ceases to exist. The Baltic states and Georgia stay out. They want no association with any post-Soviet structure. Their independence is not a transformation. It is a departure. Now only one question remains. How does the Soviet president leave office? And how does the Soviet flag come down? On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev addresses the public. He announces that he is resigning as president of the Soviet Union. He speaks in a restrained tone, defending his reforms, acknowledging the new political reality, and stating that his role is over. That evening, the Soviet flag is lowered from the Kremlin. The Russian tricolor is raised. It is a quiet act, but it contains the weight of a century. The Soviet Union ends not with gunfire and conquest, but with a flag changing in the winter darkness. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceases to exist. 15 independent states now occupy its territory. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Russia inherits the Soviet seat at the United Nations and the responsibilities of a successor state. The nuclear issue is managed through further negotiations in the years that follow, eventually consolidating nuclear weapons under Russian control. But in late 1991, the world watches a rare phenomenon, a nuclear superpower collapsing in full view. What remains after an empire falls is not only new borders, it is a new era. The Cold War ends. The bipolar world order collapses. A period of American dominance begins. In the former Soviet space, the 1990s become years of shock, instability, and deep economic pain. Old institutions vanish faster than new ones can be built. Crime grows, corruption spreads. Wars ignite in some regions. New identities form. Old memories harden. History will argue about why the Soviet Union collapsed. Some will blame economics. Some will blame nationalism. Some will blame reform. Some will blame resistance. Some will blame individuals. The truth is that collapse rarely has one cause. It has conditions, triggers, and accelerators. In 1991, the conditions were long-term. A stagnant economic system, a rigid political structure, national tensions, and a leadership trying to reform without destroying. The triggers were specific. Blood in Vilnius, strikes, the election of a rival center in Russia, and the crumbling economy. The accelerators were decisive. The failed August coup, the cascade of independence declarations, Ukraine's referendum, and the December agreements that dissolved the state without the Soviet president's consent. The Soviet Union died because it could not maintain authority, could not provide stability, and could not convince its own parts that remaining together was safer than leaving. An empire can survive hardship. It cannot survive a loss of belief in its inevitability. In January 1991, the Soviet Union still looked like a permanent fixture on the map. By December 1991, it became history. 12 months, 365 days, a superpower turned into 15 countries. The final year, the end of an empire.